Charles was caught off guard when he was asked to write a story about a remote community. At first, he hesitated, but when he saw the pamphlet detailing the location, he was shocked. The moment his eyes landed on a particular photo, his heart clenched. A woman was crouched over a small patch of soil, her hands working through the dirt. Her long skirt was frayed at the edges, and her shirt hung loosely over her frame. Even in the black and white image, Charles knew exactly who she was. Bronwyn. His Bronwyn. The room around him faded as memories flooded back. He remembered how she used to be, elegant, confident, admired by everyone. Seeing her like this, in simple clothes, her hair tied back messily, was almost too much to process. He could barely hear as Mirabelle enthusiastically suggested that Bronwyn would be the perfect subject for the article. Before he could stop it, the decision was made. His former love would be the focus of his next assignment. Charles struggled to keep his emotions in check as the meeting continued. His hands trembled, and he accidentally knocked over a glass of water, drawing attention to himself. When asked if he was okay, he quickly brushed it off, but his mind was racing. Mirabelle confirmed that Bronwyn would be contacted for an interview, and within moments, the meeting ended. As soon as everyone left, Charles rushed back to the pamphlet, flipping to the photo again, this time staring without fear of being noticed. Bronwyn looked different, older, more rugged. The graceful, polished girl he once knew was gone. Now, she was a farmer, surrounded by dirt and vegetables. He couldn't believe this was the same person who once stood at elegant events, dazzling everyone around her. He closed his eyes, and the past came rushing back. Her laughter, her ambition, the way she once tried to draw him into her world. He remembered their last conversation, the pain in her eyes when she walked away from him forever. A knock on the door startled him. Jake had returned, noticing Charles's odd behavior. Charles quickly tried to compose himself, but Jake wasn't convinced. He pressed for answers, asking if Charles knew the woman in the picture. Panic shot through him, and he denied it immediately. He couldn't let Jake know the truth. Instead, he fumbled for an excuse, claiming he wasn't the right person to write the story. He suggested that someone more suited to the lifestyle should take on the assignment, but Jake wasn't buying it. He reminded Charles that he had been eager to write more and that this was his chance. The pressure was on. If he refused, someone else would take the job. Someone else would go to Bronwyn's world and tell her story. Charles knew he couldn't let that happen. Reluctantly, he agreed, despite every instinct screaming at him to run. As Jake left, Charles sat in silence, his mind spiraling. He told himself he could handle it. He was older now, married, with a different life. But deep down, he wasn't so sure. Seeing her again, stepping into the world she had built away from him, it unsettled him in ways he wasn't ready to admit. Standing by the window, Charles stared out at the construction workers below, their movements blurred by distance and glass. His world felt just as disconnected, like something beyond his reach. The past had a way of creeping back in, no matter how much he tried to bury it. Joanna stood in front of the butcher's counter, scanning the selection of meats, trying to appear occupied. But the silence felt heavy, and in her need for conversation, she casually asked the butcher what he recommended. He suggested Cornish game hens, and she nodded, asking for 2. As he wrapped them, he mentioned a fresh shipment of lamb from a local farm, and she decided to take some of that as well. She added 2 steaks, some hamburger patties, and even considered a whole goose before her phone rang. It was her mother. She flashed the butcher an apologetic smile and picked up the call. Her mother wasted no time with greetings. "So have you heard?" she asked dramatically. Joanna, caught off guard, hesitated before responding. "Heard what?" The answer came swiftly. Her mother was going into the hospital. Her voice was laced with self-pity, her tone deliberately frail. She explained that her doctor had found a lump in her breast, and that she was certain it was already at an advanced stage. Joanna listened, gripping her cart, her stomach tightening. Her mother went on, convinced the cancer had spread, listing symptoms she had recently experienced. The weight of the conversation pressed down on Joanna, the familiar cycle of worry and exhaustion taking hold. Her mother had always been like this. She had moved to Maryland not long after Joanna's wedding, surprising everyone. Her father had left after the divorce, settling in Maine, but her mother had remained in their old house until inheriting a place in Maryland from a distant relative. Joanna had visited often, helping with her mother's medical appointments, though she struggled to understand the endless health concerns that seemed to dominate her mother's life. The new doctor, a man who indulged every self-diagnosis, had subjected her mother to countless tests and medications. Joanna suspected most of it was unnecessary, but she never confronted her directly. "When's the biopsy?" Joanna asked now, keeping her voice calm. Tuesday. Joanna offered to come the night before. Her mother feigned surprise and delight, making sure to ask if her husband would be okay with it. Joanna reassured her it would be fine. Her mother then casually invited her to a sail club event, making Joanna cringe at the thought of wealthy men in tailored suits, parading with foreign companions. The conversation shifted to Joanna's life, and she forced a cheerful tone, assuring her mother that everything was fine, that her new neighborhood had a fantastic grocery store with gourmet options. But her mother wasn't convinced. Joanna knew she couldn't share her true worries, the distance in her marriage, the small moments that left her feeling unseen. If she did, her mother would only remind her of her wedding day warning, "Don't mess this up." Then came the inevitable mention of Scott, the troubled figure at the center of growing concerns. Her mother referenced a TV special about cyberbullying, connecting it to Scott's situation. Joanna listened, uncertain how much truth there was in her mother's theories. After the call ended, she felt the familiar emptiness that always followed their conversations. She absent-mindedly reached for her phone, intending to call her husband and let him know she'd be leaving for Maryland. Before she could dial, she heard her name. She turned and saw Scott standing at the end of the aisle, hands in his pockets. Her heart jumped. Had he overheard her talking about him? The tension in her body made her voice falter as she greeted him. He smirked, holding a grocery basket. She was surprised to see him there, in a high-end store that didn't seem like his kind of place. They stood awkwardly in the frozen food section, neither moving. Joanna hesitated before suggesting they grab coffee. She braced for rejection, expecting him to laugh it off. But to her surprise, he shrugged and agreed. As he turned toward the cafe area, Joanna glanced at her shopping cart, filled with expensive meats she had impulsively chosen. The total cost startled her. She stepped away from the cart, suddenly hesitant. Scott noticed. "What?" She looked at the neatly wrapped lamb and steaks. He walked over, peered into her cart, and chuckled. "Lamb," she sighed. "I don't know what got into me." He shrugged. "Just leave it." She blinked. "Leave it?" "Yeah. I worked at a grocery store in high school. They make the workers put it back." He nodded toward the front, where employees manned the checkout lanes, looking far more polished than the usual grocery clerks. Joanna hesitated, then backed away from the cart, leaving the expensive meats behind. She followed Scott toward the cafe, the unexpected turn of events making her heartbeat quicken. Joanna sat across from the man, their conversation shifting between teasing and curiosity. He spoke about designer sneakers, something she didn't quite understand, but she recalled reading about a new store in the city. When she mentioned it, he gave her an exaggerated nod, mockingly acknowledging her knowledge. She couldn't help but feel like a student being tested.